March 27, 1945. The Ruhr Pocket, Germany. Oberst Heinrich Feutzberger stood in what remained of his command post, studying a map that showed German defensive positions still holding firm across a 20-mile front. The commander of the 338th Infantry Division had reason for cautious optimism. His troops occupied excellent defensive terrain, supply lines remained open to the east, and American attacks against his fortified positions had been repulsed with heavy casualties just that morning. "They keep trying frontal assaults," he remarked to his operations officer. "Typical American tactics. Wasteful, predictable. We can hold here for weeks." What Voitsberger didn't know, what German intelligence had completely failed to detect, was that two American armored divisions were already 40 miles behind his positions, having cut every road leading east. His supply lines existed only on his map. His defensive positions, no matter how strong, were already irrelevant. His division was already encircled, already defeated. They just didn't know it yet. This pattern would repeat across Germany in the final months of the war, as American forces demonstrated a capability that German commanders thought impossible: the ability to conduct operational-level encirclements at speeds that made reconnaissance obsolete. By the time German units realized they were being flanked, American forces were already cutting their supply lines and blocking their escape routes. The story of how American mobile warfare evolved from cautious competence to stunning operational brilliance is about more than tactics and technology. It's about the collision between German defensive expertise and American industrial mobility, between commanders fighting the current battle and those already positioned for the next one. The German military had spent centuries perfecting defensive warfare. From Frederick the Great through the World Wars, German doctrine emphasized defense in depth, prepared positions, and counterattacks against overextended enemies. By 1945, defending against numerically superior forces had become the Wehrmacht's core competency. German defensive doctrine was sophisticated and flexible. Units established main defensive lines with excellent fields of fire, backed by secondary positions and mobile reserves. Commanders identified likely attack routes and prepared kill zones with interlocking fire. Artillery was registered on approach routes. Engineers prepared demolitions to channel attackers into prepared positions. The system was designed to blunt assaults, inflict maximum casualties, and buy time for counterattacks. Against Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, this doctrine worked remarkably well. Soviet attacks, though massive, were often predictable. Red Army units advanced along obvious axes, concentrated against strong points, and suffered enormous casualties. German forces could trade space for time, falling back to prepared positions while inflicting disproportionate losses. American forces in late 1944 had initially fought the same way the Soviets fought: directly, deliberately, focused on the immediate enemy. The Normandy breakout succeeded through concentration of force at specific points. The drive across France followed main roads and obvious routes. When German forces established defensive lines, American units attacked frontally with overwhelming firepower. This approach worked but was costly and slow. The battles for Aachen, the Hürtgen Forest, and dozens of fortified towns demonstrated that German defenders, even when outnumbered and outgunned, could exact heavy tolls on attacking Americans. German commanders, observing American tactics through late 1944, felt confident they understood American capabilities and limitations. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group H in the Netherlands, articulated the prevailing German assessment in a January 1945 staff conference. "The Americans are methodical but unimaginative. They rely on firepower and frontal pressure. They advance on obvious axes, attack obvious objectives, consolidate before continuing. Their commanders are cautious, unwilling to risk encirclement or supply line vulnerability. We can predict their movements days in advance. This predictability is our advantage." This assessment was about to become catastrophically wrong. The transformation in American operational doctrine began with the Rhine crossings in March 1945. Multiple American armies crossed simultaneously at different points, overwhelming German defenders through sheer scale. But what happened after the crossings demonstrated a fundamental shift in American thinking. Instead of advancing methodically to destroy defending forces, American armored columns simply bypassed German strongpoints and drove deep into the German rear. The Remagen bridgehead illustrated this new approach. When the 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, on March 7th, German High Command expected Americans to consolidate, build up forces, then advance carefully. Instead, American armor poured across and immediately fanned out, not to destroy nearby German units, but to seize crossroads, cut communications, and create chaos in the German rear area. Within 72 hours, American forces from the Remagen bridgehead had advanced 30 miles, not in a solid front, but in multiple columns racing along parallel routes. German commanders receiving reports of American tanks in their rear areas assumed these were raids or reconnaissance elements. The possibility that entire divisions were operating 20 miles behind the front lines didn't fit German operational understanding. General Major Bayerlein, now commanding a scratch force, trying to contain the Remagen breakout, described the confusion. We received reports of American armor at a dozen locations simultaneously, many behind our positions. I assumed the reports were errors, panicked observers mistaking one American column for many. I ordered our forces to maintain defensive positions and prepare counterattacks. By the time I realized entire American divisions were in our rear, it was too late. We weren't fighting a battle, we were already encircled. The key to American mobile operations was something German commanders consistently underestimated: logistics. German operational planning assumed that advancing forces would outrun their supply lines, creating opportunities for counterattack against overextended spearheads. This assumption was based on their own experience and on fighting Soviet forces whose logistics were primitive. American logistics operated on entirely different principles. The famous Red Ball Express and similar supply routes had demonstrated that American trucks could deliver supplies at rates and distances that made traditional logistics calculations obsolete. More significantly, American doctrine built operations around logistics, rather than forcing logistics to support operations. Each American armored division traveled with organic supply units, carrying 3 days of fuel, ammunition, and supplies. Behind them, truck convoys operated in continuous shuttles, delivering supplies forward and evacuating casualties rearward. Fuel trucks could refuel moving columns. Ammunition trucks delivered directly to firing positions. The supply system moved as fast as combat units. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, 4th Armored Division, exemplified the new American operational style. His unit would become famous for relieving Bastogne, but his approach to mobile warfare was revolutionary. Abrams didn't advance to destroy enemy forces. He advanced to seize objectives, viewing enemy units as obstacles to bypass, rather than targets to destroy. The Germans want us to fight for every town, every crossroad, Abrams explained to his company commanders. That's their game, and they're good at it. So we don't play. We identify their strong points and go around them. They can have the towns. We'll take the roads behind them. A German battalion defending a town is only dangerous if we attack it. If we bypass it and cut its supply lines, it becomes irrelevant. This philosophy, multiplied across dozens of American units, created operational chaos for German commanders. The traditional defensive approach of identifying the enemy's main axis of advance and concentrating forces to stop it became impossible when American forces advanced on multiple axes simultaneously, none clearly the main effort. The encirclement of the Ruhr pocket demonstrated American mobile warfare at its most devastating. The operation began on March 25th, when the U.S. Ninth Army, having crossed the Rhine in the north, began driving east. Simultaneously, the First Army, breaking out from the Remagen bridgehead, drove northeast. The obvious objective to German observers was the Ruhr industrial region itself. German defensive preparations focused on protecting the Ruhr. Model's Army Group B, still numbering over 300,000 men, and considered one of the Wehrmacht's most capable formations, established strong defensive positions facing west. The plan was to absorb American attacks, inflict heavy casualties, and buy time for new defensive lines to be established further east. What German commanders failed to grasp was that the Americans had no intention of attacking into the Ruhr. The two American armies weren't advancing to destroy Army Group B, they were advancing to encircle it. On April 1st, forward elements of the 1st and 9th Armies met at Lippstadt, 50 miles east of the Ruhr. Army Group B, focused on defending against westward attacks, suddenly discovered they were completely surrounded. Over 300,000 German troops occupied excellent defensive positions, facing the wrong direction, their supply lines already cut, their communications already severed. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, was arguably Germany's most skilled defensive commander. He had stopped Soviet offensives through tactical brilliance and inspired leadership. He had contained the Normandy breakout longer than thought possible. He understood modern warfare as well as any German commander. Yet, he hadn't seen the encirclement coming until it was complete. Model's last message to his corps commanders revealed his shock. "We have been maneuvered, not defeated. Our positions remain strong. Our troops fight well. But we are already surrounded by forces we never engaged, cut off by advances we never opposed. The Americans fought a different battle than we prepared for. They seized space while we prepared to defend ground. This is not the warfare I understand." The German units trapped in the Ruhr pocket fought with characteristic skill and determination. American forces probing the perimeter were repeatedly repulsed. German defensive positions remained formidable, but tactical excellence had become operationally irrelevant. The Wehrmacht's last major field army in the West was encircled, not because they were outfought, but because they were outmaneuvered at a scale and speed they hadn't thought possible. What made the Ruhr encirclement particularly devastating was how quickly it happened. From the Rhine crossings to complete encirclement took just 17 days. German intelligence had tracked American movements, but consistently underestimated their speed and overestimated their caution. Reports of American armor deep in the German rear were dismissed as exaggerations or confused with German units, until captured American equipment provided undeniable proof. Oberst Günther Reichhelm, operations officer for Army Group B, later described the intelligence failure. "We received reports daily of American positions. Each report seemed impossible. How could they advance so far so fast? We assumed communication errors, panicked reports from rear area units unfamiliar with combat. We plotted American advances based on their historical rates of movement. We were calculating based on old data while they were operating at new speeds. By the time we accepted the reports were accurate, we were already surrounded." The encirclement technique that trapped Army Group B was replicated across Germany in the final weeks of the war. American mobile columns would probe German defenses, identify strong points, then simply drive around them. German commanders would prepare to defend key cities only to discover American forces had bypassed them entirely, leaving them isolated and irrelevant. The fate of the 11th Panzer Division illustrated this pattern. Considered one of the Wehrmacht's elite formations, the division had been carefully positioned to defend Frankfurt. When American forces approached in late March, the division prepared for the expected battle. Instead, American columns bypassed Frankfurt entirely, driving north and south around the city. By the time the 11th Panzer Division realized the main American forces had passed them by, they were 40 miles behind American lines with no route of retreat. General Major Wend von Wietersheim, commanding the division, radioed in frustration. "We prepared to defend the city. They took the highways around it. We repositioned to block their advance. They had already advanced past us. We are ready to fight, but there is no one here to fight. The Americans are behind us, ahead of us, and on both flanks. We don't know where their front line is because they don't seem to have one." This operational confusion became standard for German units in April 1945. Traditional concepts of front lines and rear areas became meaningless when American mobile columns operated throughout the depth of the theater. German strongpoints would maintain excellent local security, while American supply trucks drove past them miles away on parallel roads. The speed of American advances made German reconnaissance obsolete. By the time German scouts identified American positions and reported back, those positions were already 20 miles further east. German commanders found themselves fighting based on intelligence that was hours old, which in mobile warfare meant it was worse than useless. It was actively misleading. The technological advantage that enabled American mobile warfare was often overlooked. Radios. Every American tank, every command vehicle, most trucks had radios. Commanders could coordinate movements in real time, call for support, report enemy positions, and receive updated orders without stopping. The entire American advance was networked in ways German forces couldn't match. German communications still relied heavily on landlines and dispatch riders. When American columns cut through an area, they severed phone lines and made dispatch riders suicidal. German units would lose contact with headquarters for hours or days. Commanders made decisions based on outdated information, while American commanders coordinated operations in real time. Lieutenant Colonel William Hamburg, commanding a combat command in the 7th Armored Division, described the communication advantage. We knew where every American unit was at all times. We could coordinate with forces 50 miles away. We could call in airstrikes, artillery, or adjacent units within minutes. The Germans were blind and deaf. They didn't know where we were, didn't know where their own units were, couldn't coordinate responses. It wasn't a fair fight. We had perfect information and perfect coordination. They had confusion. The air superiority that American forces enjoyed by April 1945 compounded German confusion. American reconnaissance aircraft tracked German movements constantly. Fighter bombers attacked any significant German force attempting to maneuver. German commanders couldn't concentrate forces for counterattacks without being spotted and struck from the air. More significantly, American air reconnaissance provided real-time intelligence to advancing columns. Pilots could radio positions of German forces, identify roadblocks, and vector ground units around obstacles. The integration of air and ground operations reached levels of sophistication that German forces, whose Luftwaffe barely existed by this point, couldn't comprehend. The psychological impact on German troops was profound. Soldiers accustomed to understanding the battlefield, to knowing where friendly and enemy forces were positioned, found themselves in a fog of confusion. Units would wake to discover American forces had passed during the night. Supply convoys would depart for the front and never arrive. Captured by American forces the units didn't know existed. Lieutenant Karl Heinz Bosca, a platoon commander in the 89th Infantry Division, kept a diary that captured this disorientation. April 3rd. Americans attacked our positions. We repulsed them with heavy casualties. April 4th. Americans attacked again. Again repulsed. We are holding well. April 5th. Supply column failed to arrive. April 6th. No supplies. Radio reports American tanks 20 kilometers to our rear. Impossible. We are the front line. April 7th. American tanks visible in all directions. We are surrounded. When did this happen? We won every engagement, yet we have lost. The Wehrmacht's institutional response to American mobile warfare was hampered by Hitler's insistence that units hold ground rather than maneuver. German commanders, who understood they were being encircled and requested permission to withdraw, were routinely denied. Units were ordered to hold positions even when those positions had become strategically irrelevant. Model himself, commanding Army Group B in the Ruhr pocket, understood the futility but couldn't overcome Hitler's orders. His forces controlled excellent defensive terrain and could have inflicted significant casualties on any American assault, but American forces didn't assault. They simply tightened the ring and waited. The pocket was compressed methodically, not through combat, but through logistics. As supplies ran out, German defensive capability collapsed. The final irony of the Ruhr Pocket was that the Americans used traditional siege tactics against a modern mobile force. German units that had been trained for offensive warfare, that had conquered most of Europe through rapid maneuver, found themselves trapped in a pocket and reduced through simple attrition. The army group that had been Germany's mobile reserve became a static target. On April 15th, with his forces reduced to holding scattered pockets in the Ruhr cities, with no supplies, no fuel, and no hope of relief, Model dissolved Army Group B and released his soldiers from their oaths. He then walked into the woods and shot himself. The commander who had never lost a battle had lost the war through an operational encirclement he never saw coming. The rapidity with which organized German resistance collapsed in April 1945 shocked even American commanders. Entire German divisions surrendered when they realized they were surrounded. Units that could have fought for weeks chose capitulation over futile resistance. The psychological impact of being outmaneuvered proved more devastating than combat losses. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, captured when his command post was overrun by American forces he hadn't known were in the area, provided a detailed assessment during interrogation. "We prepared to fight the Americans based on what we observed in 1944. Methodical, firepower-heavy, cautious. What we faced in 1945 was different. They had learned. They moved faster than we thought possible. They bypassed rather than engaged. They encircled rather than assaulted. Most critically, they could sustain operations at speeds that should have been impossible." Traditional military thinking says rapid advances are fragile. The spearhead outpaces its logistics and becomes vulnerable. This applied to all armies in history. It did not apply to the Americans. Their logistics were as mobile as their combat units. They could maintain divisions in combat 100 kilometers from their start point, with no degradation in capability. This changed everything. We weren't defeated in battle. We were defeated operationally. American forces were behind us before we knew they had advanced. Our strong points became irrelevant. Our careful preparations became meaningless. They fought a different kind of war, one where mobility and logistics mattered more than tactical skill. The encirclement of Bayerlein's own command illustrated his point perfectly. His units had established excellent defensive positions north of Dusseldorf. American forces probed these positions for 2 days, then simply drove around them on both flanks. By the time Bayerlein ordered withdrawal, American forces had already blocked all retreat routes. His entire command was captured, having fired only a fraction of their ammunition, not because they were defeated tactically, but because they were surrounded operationally. The German military's failure to adapt to American mobile warfare wasn't due to lack of understanding. Many German commanders recognized what was happening. The problem was systemic inflexibility. The Wehrmacht's command structure, increasingly dominated by Hitler's direct interference, couldn't adjust to a situation where holding ground had become counterproductive. Moreover, German forces lacked the mobility to respond, even when they identified the threat. American armored divisions could move 50 miles in a day. German units, by April 1945, were increasingly foot mobile with limited vehicle transport. By the time a German division marched to counter an American penetration, the Americans had advanced another 50 miles. The fuel situation compounded German immobility. What vehicles the Wehrmacht still possessed often couldn't move due to fuel shortages. Panzer divisions existed on paper, but consisted of immobilized tanks being used as static pillboxes. American forces could maneuver freely, while German forces were increasingly tied to fixed positions simply because they lacked fuel to move. American commanders, recognizing German immobility, exploited it ruthlessly. The classic American operation in April 1945 involved fixing German forces with a frontal demonstration, while mobile columns raced around both flanks to cut off withdrawal routes. German commanders would prepare for the expected frontal assault, organize defensive fires, position reserves, then discover American forces were already behind them. The meeting between American and Soviet forces at the Elbe River in April 1945 was delayed not by German resistance, but by the speed of American advances. Soviet forces, accustomed to grinding through German defensive lines yard by yard, were shocked to learn American units were already deep into what Soviet intelligence considered German-held territory. Marshal Konev, commanding the First Ukrainian Front, received reports of American forces approaching from the west that he initially dismissed as impossible. How can they be at the Elbe? Between the Rhine and the Elbe are 300 kilometers of German territory and multiple German armies. The Americans would need weeks to advance this far. Yet the reports are confirmed. They have not fought through German defenses. They have bypassed them. This is not how we fight. This is not how anyone fights. How do you defend against an enemy that doesn't attack your positions, but simply drives around them? The Soviet approach to German defensive positions was to mass overwhelming force and crush through them. The American approach was to identify defensive positions and avoid them entirely. Both methods achieved results, but the American method achieved them faster and with fewer casualties. German forces that could have inflicted thousands of casualties in defensive battles simply surrendered when they realized they were already encircled and cut off. The final weeks of the war saw German units surrendering en masse, not because they were defeated in battle, but because they realized continued resistance was pointless. The Wehrmacht's careful defensive positions, prepared with skill and occupied by determined troops, became irrelevant when American mobile columns bypassed them. German soldiers found themselves defending ground that no longer mattered, protecting supply lines that were already cut, holding positions the enemy had no intention of attacking. General Oberst Heinrici, commanding Army Group Vistula, attempted to explain to Hitler why withdrawals were necessary. The Americans don't attack our positions. They encircle them. They don't fight for cities. They seize the roads around them. Every day we hold the fixed positions is another day their mobile columns advance deeper into our rear. We cannot defend everywhere, and they only need to break through anywhere. Our defensive strategy assumes they will attack our strong points. They simply bypass them. Hitler's response was to order no retreats and to court-martial commanders who withdrew without permission. This inflexibility ensured that when German units finally realized they were encircled, it was too late to escape. Entire divisions surrendered with their equipment intact, having never engaged American forces, simply because they woke up one morning to discover they were already surrounded. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division exemplified this pattern. Positioned to defend Halle, the division prepared elaborate defensive positions and was confident in its ability to hold. American forces approached from the west, and the division prepared to defend. Instead, American columns bypassed Halle to the north and south, meeting 30 miles east of the city. The division received orders to break out, but American forces already blocked every route. After 3 days of futile attempts to punch through the encirclement, during which they suffered more casualties than in months of previous fighting, the division surrendered. They had been tactically undefeated, operationally irrelevant, and strategically lost before they even knew they were surrounded. In post-war interviews, German commanders consistently returned to the theme of being outmaneuvered rather than outfought. The shame wasn't in losing battles, but in losing without having fought, in being encircled before they realized they were in danger, in surrendering not because they were defeated tactically, but because they had been rendered strategically irrelevant. General der Panzertruppe Eberbach, captured commanding the 7th Army, provided perhaps the most succinct assessment. We prepared to fight the war we understood. The Americans fought the war they invented. We defended territory. They seized logistics. We held strong points. They took crossroads. We positioned forces to repel attacks. They positioned forces to prevent our withdrawal. When we finally understood what they were doing, we were already surrounded. You cannot win a battle you don't know you're fighting until you've already lost. The operational revolution that American forces underwent between December 1944 and April 1945 transformed warfare. The traditional relationship between offense and defense, between tactical victory and strategic success, between holding ground and seizing objectives, all were redefined. The Americans demonstrated that in an age of industrial mobility, operational maneuver could achieve what tactical combat could not. The German military, for all its professional skill and tactical excellence, remained intellectually tied to earlier forms of warfare where front lines were concrete, where battles had clear locations, where you defeated the enemy by fighting them. The Americans, unburdened by centuries of military tradition, created a new paradigm where you defeated the enemy by rendering them irrelevant through operational positioning. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the lesson was complete. American mobile warfare had encircled and captured more German soldiers than were killed in combat. The Wehrmacht's last major formations surrendered, not because they were destroyed, but because they were surrounded. Not because they couldn't fight, but because there was nowhere to fight from. No supplies to fight with, and no prospect of relief. The soldiers, who hadn't known they were already flanked, who prepared for battles that never came, who woke up one morning to discover American forces were already behind them, they became the symbol of the gap between German tactical excellence and American operational dominance. The laughter had stopped long before the Ruhr Pocket. By April 1945, German soldiers weren't dismissing American capabilities. They were surrendering to forces they never even saw coming. The encirclement was complete before they knew it had begun. The battle was lost before they knew it was being fought. And the war was over before they understood how completely the nature of warfare had changed. In the end, the most devastating weapon America deployed wasn't their tanks, their artillery, or their aircraft. It was their ability to be somewhere else, to operate throughout the depth of the theater, to move faster than German intelligence could track, to encircle positions before defenders knew they were threatened, and to render tactical excellence operationally irrelevant through sheer mobility and logistical capacity. The German soldiers who didn't know they were already flanked learned the hardest lesson in military history, that you can win every tactical engagement and still lose operationally, that you can defend every position and still be surrounded, and that in modern warfare, the army that can sustain mobile operations faster than the enemy can respond will prevail regardless of tactical skill. The Americans hadn't just flanked German forces. They had flanked German thinking, bypassed German doctrine, and encircled German understanding of warfare itself. By the time German commanders realized what was happening, it was already too late. The flanking maneuver was complete, the encirclement was closed, and the war was lost.